Modern critics of post-second wave feminism, such as Abby Shapiro, often argue that first-wave feminism was largely about legal equity, and that feminism only became radical and destructive from the 1960s onward. Suzanne Venker has also stated that feminism did not become a dominant cultural ideology until its second wave. She praises the suffragettes as largely married, family-oriented women. This narrative, that first-wave feminism was reasonable, while later waves went off the rails, largely originates with academic Christina Hoff Sommers. In Who Stole Feminism, she distinguishes between what she calls equity feminism and gender feminism, portraying the former as a positive reform movement and the latter as an ideological excess. I once held this view. I believed that first-wave feminism was broadly beneficial and that the real problems began in the 1960s. That changed after I engaged with the work of retired English professor Janice Fiamengo, whose historical research, particularly on the Studio Brule channel, examines feminism critically from its very beginnings. I will be drawing on her work in this video. I will also be drawing on The Feminist Lie by Bob Lewis, one of the few works that examines feminism from its misandric roots. This video is the first in a short series examining the history of feminism from its first wave through to the fourth. To understand feminism, we need to look at what is often called proto-feminism, early ideas about women's rights that emerged before feminism was formalized as a political movement. Feminism, as an ideology, took place during the European Enlightenment and the French Revolution. It developed alongside broader challenges to monarchy, feudalism, and institutional Christianity. The Enlightenment, spanning roughly the 17th and 18th centuries, promoted ideas of individual rights, secularism, and political reform. What is often ignored is that under feudal systems, political rights were restricted for almost everyone. The vast majority of men did not have the vote either. Democratic participation in the West expanded slowly and unevenly throughout the 19th century, largely as a result of working-class reform movements rather than feminist activism. One of the earliest feminist figures was Olympe de Gouges, who wrote The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791. She argued that women were oppressed by what she described as perpetual male tyranny. Shortly after, Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792. While often celebrated as a founding feminist philosopher, Wollstonecraft frequently described women as frivolous and weak, and argued that men were responsible for women's supposed inferiority. The central problem with these early feminist arguments is that they framed upper and middle class women as an oppressed class, while ignoring far more severe injustices occurring at the same time, such as slavery, colonial violence, and the extreme hardships faced by working class men. Crucially, these early thinkers showed little to no interest in male suffering or male obligations. Historically, men were expected to shoulder honor, duty, labor, and sacrifice, often at significant personal cost. Men worked dangerous jobs, fought wars, and were judged by their ability to protect and provide. This is not to deny that some men abused women. Of course they did. But cruelty is not sex-specific. Feminist theory, from its inception, framed men collectively as oppressors, while failing to acknowledge mutual dependence between man and woman, particularly within marriage and family life. The word féminisme was popularized in the 1830s by French utopian socialist Charles Fourier. Fourier believed that the family structure was oppressive and should be radically reorganized, an idea that later became central to feminist theory. Friedrich Engels' The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State was especially influential. Engels argued that marriage and the nuclear family were instruments of female oppression under patriarchy. These ideas were foundational to later feminist critiques of marriage, motherhood, and domestic life. While Marx and Engels did identify flaws in early industrial capitalism, their proposed solution was total social revolution. They explicitly called for the abolition of private property and the traditional family, ideas later absorbed by feminism. Feminism, historically, has been closely aligned with radical left-wing ideology. Many early feminists were openly anti-capitalist, despite benefiting from the economic stability that capitalism provided. Supporting welfare capitalism or social democracy is not the same as endorsing socialist revolution. I myself am an advocate of social democracy, but not socialism or communism in the revolutionary sense. The first women's rights convention in the United States was held in 1848 at Seneca Falls, New York. This event is widely considered the birth of American feminism. One of its key figures was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who openly expressed hostility towards men. She described men as a destructive force responsible for violence, disorder, and death. Decades later, Stanton wrote in her diary that women were infinitely superior to men. If such a statement were made in reverse today, it would be universally condemned as misogyny. Stanton also authored the Declaration of Sentiments, which was signed by both men and women. This raises an obvious question. How could women organize public political conventions, publish manifestos, and gain male support if they were truly enslaved under patriarchy? It is also worth remembering that legal protections often favored women. For example, Britain's 1842 Coal Mines Act banned women and girls from working underground for safety reasons, while boys as young as 10 were still permitted to do so. By the late 19th century, thousands of men and boys died annually in coal mining accidents. In 1913, men's rights advocate Ernest Belford Bax published The Fraud of Feminism, arguing that feminism sought female privilege rather than equality. He noted that women were often more socially protected, perceived as more innocent, and exempt from many of the harsh expectations placed on men. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married couple was treated as a single legal unit, with property held in the husband's name. Feminists portray this as oppression, but historically it reflected economic practicality and shared responsibility. Men bore legal and financial liability for property, debt, and public obligations, while women typically managed the household. This division of labor was about cooperation, not domination. Importantly, property ownership itself was rare and limited to the wealthy. Most men never owned land. Historical examples complicate the feminist narrative. Margaret Brent became one of the largest landowners in colonial Maryland in the 17th century. English common law allowed women to inherit property in the absence of male heirs, a practice confirmed by historical research on aristocratic families. In the UK, the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 expanded women's legal control over earnings and property. These reforms were achieved gradually within the existing legal system, not through revolutionary feminism. Voting rights are often framed as a women's issue, but this ignores the broader context of democratic reform. For centuries, most men could not vote either. In Britain, the first Reform Act was passed in 1932, allowing 1 in 6 property-owning men to vote. The Second Reform Act was passed in 1867, expanding the vote to urban working-class men. The Third Reform Act was passed in 1884, extending voting to rural working-class men. By this point, roughly 40% of British men could not vote. The Representation of the People Act was passed in 1918, granting all men over 21 the vote. Women over 30 could vote if they owned property. Finally, in 1928, voting rights were given to all men and women aged over 21. The suffragettes are often portrayed as heroic reformers, but many engaged in violent tactics. Under Emmeline Pankhurst's leadership, the suffragettes bombed churches, damaged public buildings, and committed arson, acts documented in Simon Webb's book The Suffragette Bombers. They also participated in the White Feather Campaign, shaming working-class men into enlisting during World War I, despite not campaigning for those men's political rights. In the United States, Susan B. Anthony notoriously stated that she would rather cut off her arm than see black men given the vote before women, a statement that reflects the racism present within early feminism. Notably, organized women's anti-suffrage movements existed, led by figures such as Mary Augusta Ward, who feared that political activism would disrupt social cohesion. Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood in 1916, is frequently celebrated as a feminist pioneer. However, Sanger was an outspoken supporter of eugenics, a widely accepted but deeply racist ideology at the time. She believed birth control could be used to reduce the reproduction of what she called the unfit, and actively collaborated with eugenics organizations. While modern supporters often argue her views were typical of the era, this aspect of her legacy is routinely downplayed. First wave feminism was not a struggle for equality. It was often racist, classist, and openly sexist towards men. It showed little concern for male suffering, male labor, or male sacrifice. Lasting roughly from 1848 to the early 20th century, first wave feminism laid the ideological groundwork for the misandry and social fragmentation seen in later feminist movements. Understanding the history matters because ideas have consequences.